I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss-Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hey everyone.
Hello.
Tell me if you've heard this one before. You get there to session 0 or the first session if you don't have one at the game table. And one of the players has just made a human fighter, has no backstory, and they have no idea what anything in the setting is. And another person has made this elven ranger and has written 25 pages about their entire familial history, which spans back multiple millennia because they're an elf, and how everything works, and the favorite food of their
their childhood best friend,
and their aunt's friend's granddaughter, and
their first pet, and everything you would need to answer the classic security questions.
Yes, you would be able to get onto the bank account of this elf immediately, and the GM is just not even sure if they can read that entire elf backstory. How much of it can they actually use in the campaign is very questionable, and to some extent the backstory for that elf exists more or less just for the elf's player, and they're happy, and maybe the GM picks up a fact or two out of there and can use it.
Shannon talks about limiting players to 1 page at most for readability.
Right. So there are definitely tips such as maybe limiting players how long the backstory is and incentivizing them to not have zero backstory by giving some kind of bribe. I've seen that before with have a backstory of the appropriate length and gain an extra lore skill or something. But there is another way to go about this. And one of the ways to kind of think about the idea of improvising backstories is to take a note from the way some other kind of narrative RPGs or RPGs that have different structures in terms of backstories take care of this kind of situation.
So one of the things to consider is that a character, no matter how light their backstory is, they do have at least some implied backstory in that any abilities that the character has had to have been something that they learned at some point.
Pathfinder and 5e, to that extent, help you a significant amount compared to some versions of D&D likes, because they do have a background that you take that definitely implies a backstory. And yes, Pathfinder 1 had traits, but they didn't really... They just generally implied that all of your magi were from the Minatan archipelago where they trained with Wayang ancestry. But if you asked 90% of those players, oh wow, you trained with Wayangs? What was it like in Minata? They'd be like, what's a Minata? But don't you have a regional trait?
And then so many people were bullied as children.
There were a lot of people bullied as children. But don't you have a regional trait from Minata because you're from Minata? They're like, no. But you do. You have Wayang Spellhunter. Yes, it's overpowered. It's so strong. So, when it comes to backgrounds in Pathfinder 2, and in 5e, they do encourage you to get into the question of where your character came from. And one thing is that obviously it takes way more space in 5e than the Pathfinder background, so it's hard to print very many of them. But the 5e backgrounds with their little D8 and D6 tables of possible background-related facts are a good way to start thinking about backgrounds. Think about how your background led to connections and quirks and flaws of your character as well. But what we're really talking about when we're saying improvising backstories isn't just whether or not the game system gives you something to hang your backstory on, with the backgrounds, but also some game systems actually give you the opportunity to build your background as you go. And building your background as you go is actually a great way to make sure that your background actually works and is very relevant to the story.
This may happen if you have a player who maybe is in between these two extremes of no sense of backstory and, I have written you a novel, please read. If you have a player who's like, yeah, I figure my character used to work as a guard on some caravan somewhere, and they got sick of working as a caravan guard, and they decided that they want to be a mercenary. And then, there is some implication there of like, well, they didn't talk about where they were a caravan guard or how they got into that or whatever. But then if you have something that comes up in the story that's like, oh, yeah, this is a merchant business that often hires caravan guards or what have you, then maybe you can ask the player like, hey, there's a merchant business here that often hires caravan guards. Do you think your character might have been connected to it? So even if they have like a very vague sense that they've given, you can find a way to tie that into specific.
In this episode of Player Tools, we are the player. Mm-hmm. So we have had previous episodes for like, what about that mastermind GM who like reads the entire adventure path in advance and draws a web of connections to every NPC.
Yes, you're right.
And then is like, and even I've talked about how I've done that before, Jade Regent and War for the Crown, where players gave me the very, very cliff note background that they wanted for their character, and I was like, okay, it's like War for the Crown player, you want to have a family that like promoted like wizard like arcane casting and is kind of scummy and you don't like them and you have issues with them. All right, cool. That works for me. We'll say that your character was part of the Lothide family and your mother's maiden name was Bethany. And that worked very well for me in the adventure path. Or in Jade Regent, where someone who was a sylph, and I asked them if their father could be like a wizard with a very particular name who was going to the North Pole to study like the magic of the environment in that area. Because I had read everything and I knew I could connect people into it. But this is not the episode where we're going to go deeply into the GM having everything figured out in advance, realizing that you're connected to that. This is for improvising backstory.
So let me take what I was just saying there and then twist that around into the player version. If you have a sense that like, you want your character to have been a caravan guard at some point in the past, but you didn't establish it, and then like the GM presents a mercantile organization, then you could say to the GM, hey GM, maybe my character used to work for this group in the past. Or like if you visit, like when you run into like some random NPC, if your character's like, yeah, you know what, I've decided my character's like really into swords, and then like the players go out and they're looking around for things and they run into a blacksmith and you're like, yeah, maybe I've met this blacksmith before and they were the one who forged my sword, and sort of like that's why that's sort of like I have this connection. It's here.
That's correct. So exactly like Linda said, the correct way to go through things, and you ask the GM for permission if they want to do it, is you see something that looks like it might link to your backstory, and you ask, can this be the link? And the GM knows more, so they know if it can't. For example, I am playing a Fire Elemental Avatar character, which is the class that I'm playtesting for Roll for Combat that does one of like 20 elements, 13 of which are in the initial release, that from like being an avatar of this elemental being that's inside of you. We were playing Quest for Frozen Flame, and so I had found this little fire taper that like can evolve into a giant burning flame mammoth. And this was after like someone from our local following had just like abandoned me during a scouting mission and left me for dead. And I survived. I found this fire thing. I made it back by myself. And I did not like this person, but they had too much social clout. So we heard that there was this person who was in our group of scouts who was terrible that nobody liked, named Picano, which we found out at the very beginning of the adventure path. It's like the very first thing that happened. So I was like, I'd like to say that Picano was the person who just left me out to dry, because he also is like the son of someone important. So it's like, this seems like the person who would be a good fit. And the GM was like, yes, that is a very good fit for that. So we're going to say that Thule was left out to die by Picano.
Another direction that I've sometimes seen people take for improvising backstories is like as justification for the way that they want their character build to grow. So, maybe you're saying, sometimes when you take certain options, they reflect what experiences your character has had. But if you're like, you know, I think that I want my character to, like, take the medic archetype or whatever, but you haven't necessarily had experiences in the game, but you might be like, yeah, you know, that's something they've been interested in doing for a while because of some experiences they had in the past, you know, when they saw a group of rampaging wildebeests that tore through their home, and, like, they really admired the people who helped to
their uncle
treat people after that, and
dropped their father into the rampaging wildebeest.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
Then they went to live with a warthog.
It's the circle of life.
Yeah.
Yes. But
and
yeah,
a meerkat.
Yeah, I don't know why wildebeest just came into my head there, but they did.
You know what? It can't. You know, there's electric wildebeest is like one of the Eldamons. So maybe you were thinking of I Own You.
I was not. I was just thinking of some kind of a rampaging animal that had horns, and for some reason wildebeest. Anyway, yeah. So it could be like as a justification for an ability that you want to take on later, or like a piece of gear that you find, or like if you see something that happens in the story and you as the player are like, wow, you know, I think that's cool and I want to see more of that. You know, like the GM is describing something about the architecture of this particular area, and you're like, yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Then you might decide, yeah, you know, my character's always had an interest in the history of in the history of the nation of Thassalon, and so, you know, then you can say, oh, and here's how that interest manifested at earlier times. So it can be, so you can use it as sort of like a justification to push things in the game more in the direction that you're interested in, because like backstories in many cases are like a request to the GM to do more of a particular thing, or to say like, here's what my character is about and what kinds of things interest and excite me and what I want to show. So by developing that backstory during the session, you can really tell if, you know, the GM's going to know if you're like, oh yeah, you know, my character actually has always been interested in the history of this particular culture that you're just presenting now, and so they're really excited about this, and the GM's going to know this player wants to hear more about this.
So here's some techniques you could use for improvising backstories that are just sort of taken from other RPGs. So there's some RPGs where a character who emphasizes or reveals something for their backstory, or a character who learns something and grows and changes, earns XP in those systems. Now, I'm not saying that you as the player should try to push your GM to get XP. You don't have to get XP. The point is, at the end of each session in some of these systems is when you think about those questions and possibly earn XP. Even in Pathfinder or D&D, where you don't get XP for that, you could think about at the end of the session, did your character change and grow? Did your character reveal something from the past, and try to put it at a particular pace? There are other systems where around the campfire, when you rest in character, the characters like tell each other stories about their past, and then either become closer to the current characters or reveal like a bond or connection they had to something from their backstory all along that they just hadn't talked about yet up until that point. And it's a part of character growth. So you could consider whether there are in-character and out-of-character milestones through which you can gradually reveal your character. The other thing about this is that it's not too overwhelming for the other players or the GM. Even if you have the 10-page backstory, that the GM may or may not read it, but if your character, like at the beginning when you're meeting in the tavern or something like that, it's like, introduce yourself, and the dwarf is, you know, like, I'm a dwarf and I love to drink. And then it's your elf ranger's turn. It's like, I am Felinireal. I'm from the forest of Njorndarir, where I raised by my mother Argonar and my father Augustin, who was originally an archmage in the employ of the Forenian Empire for a time, until after supporting a rival faction to the throne, the prince couped the government and all of the previous court mages were removed, where he fell in love with my mother and they moved back to the forest. However, the elders of the time in the forest were against this, and there was therefore a large council of elders that met and had a big vote where everybody was talking about it. My uncle Sarkanir, who was a warlord who wanted to unite the elves in order to create an army that could be used to conquer the local areas, supported my father's marriage at first, but that was to be used to overthrow the elders, which happened, causing a civil war between the elves that eventually led to elven expansionism. And then and it just keep going and going. Everyone's just like, the dwarf players, I'm a dwarf. I like to drink. Yep. But if you reveal each of these things one at a time, it's not so much that it will overwhelm the other players and the GM, so they will be more likely to remember these elements of your character's backstory and to be able to apply them.
To speak to another great opportunity to both consider and reveal aspects of backstory is when your character needs to make a decision between, some tough options. What is it that they use to decide, and what kinds of past life experiences may inform that decision? Are there specific things that they have learned, whether that, and those maybe, particularly you're farther along into a campaign, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that a year ago when we forgot to carefully check every door for traps, and we rushed in because we were too worried that, we wouldn't get there in time, then the giant fireball exploded, and then there was a collapse, and therefore we took even more time, so now we're more cautious. But sometimes, it might be that the decision points are based on certain experiences from their backstory.
Mm-hmm. And people in chat, Rico is saying that the PFS fighter's story is mostly about being a really old elf and a narrative about retraining the skills each day with the elf ancestry feed.
Oh, that's cool.
And Faceless Man said that connections through food is fun, even subtle comments on tastes like back home when eating something truly bizarre.
And it's like, where did you grow up?
Yep, absolutely. So all of these give you a good pacing, because when you're improvising backstories, even if you've improvised a little bit ahead, or you even know more about it, even maybe you've secretly written some of this 10-page thing, you just don't share it with everyone. If you sprinkle it through lightly, it's actually going to have more of an effect. Like, how many people can now remember the details of what I said about that elf backstory that I just said it a few minutes ago? But if each one of those elements came up, it was like
the father and the mother's relationship.
If there was like a political event that happened in the story, and then my elf was like, this reminds me of when my father was kicked out of the Royal Mages after the prince's faction lost it.
And also another thing about that in terms of revealing it to the group is notice that time Mark said my father and the prince's faction instead of suddenly introducing giant proper names that no one's gonna remember.
Even I don't remember. I think it was like Argonar was his mom.
Yeah, I don't remember. That's a tip from adventure creation in general, is that people do not remember random proper names that you throw at them.
That's right.
Oh, that's cool. Ashmental is working on a campaign where the players have amnesia, and they discover certain things about their past that may or may not be true because they have powerful enemies. But they get to build their backstory by discovering and then accepting or rejecting if that's who they are now.
Absolutely.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
That is very similar to one of the possible stories of the Dungeon Ancestry. If anyone has Dungeons Expanded from the Battlezoo Ancestry's Year of Monsters, so there's a free Battlezoo Ancestry's Year of Monsters on Battlezoo.com that just kind of has the basics of playing as an intelligent dungeon. But in the expanded version from Year of Monsters, it talks about like the different like sort of magical and psychological aspects of being a dungeon. And one of the types of dungeons is one where you, the dungeon avatar, don't really know what's going on. But each time you beat a major floor, more of these like pieces of memory come to you. And you're able to learn more about yourself, like how you became a dungeon avatar, or other secrets that are slowly revealed as you go down each floor of the dungeon.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain questions if you're thinking about improvising the backstory, like, what your favorite food was when you were 10 is probably never going to be relevant to the context of the campaign. But things like...
But my elf had a different favorite food at the ages of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130, 140, and 150.
I'm so glad that you're not as ridiculous. You're not nearly this ridiculous in actual game.
After all, as a 70-year-old, he was still kind of childish. And so, therefore...
Yeah, but what's things that are more likely to be relevant are things like the people that your character believes in and trusts, and would go to outside of like their fellow PCs, the people who they might consider to be like enemies or rivals or people that have wronged them, causes or organizations to which they belong or belonged in the past, or like people who might have like be part of like a rival cause or an organization that might have something out for them.
Absolutely.
As well as like major aspects of like their training and things like that. It's like, you know, where did you grow up, like, and then from there, where did you go? Sort of like the top level, what places and people were most important in their story.
Mm-hmm. It seems like Tell the Locadora every time they hear Dungeon Ancestry, you know, that they get confused by it
things
again.
Like Taste Like Back Home, absolutely. Like the fact is that to me is more about like establishing more about like the fine details about where they were and where they came from than like, you know, when I was 10, this was a thing that was important, because this is important to them now that it's something that they remember. And that
also, if you do the campfire thing where everyone at least out of character reveals something else about their backstory, if there are NPCs around, the GM can use it as a way to do an info dump as well. It's like everyone reveals something and the GM has the NPC say something that's like important to move the plot, for example.
Another improvising backstory thing that I sometimes see is when players decide that they want to entwine their backstories more than they'd originally intended. And they want to say it like, oh, yeah, you see this like maybe particularly early on, if you would want to say like, oh, yeah, these characters knew each other before. But it may be the fact that they have a common experience, that like, you know, one of the people is an elf wizard who went to this arcane academy that they have extensively researched, and another player is decided like, oh yeah, you know, maybe my character was an arcane academy dropout and the school they went to was that same school.
Or my character is the elf ranger that we mentioned before, but the other person's character is actually the princess, who is the descendant of the faction that got rid of the prince, who was the one who the father of the elf was the royal mage for. So, like, it was actually from a rival faction of the father of the royal mage, although this princess, like, she's not involved with that. That happened with her grandparents.
And that can be cool too, because, you know, you can work that out with the player out of character, but then to what extent do the characters know about those connections? There may be like secrets that they reveal to each other over time, and then you think about how do they feel about those.
And maybe the dwarf player who just likes to drink decides that the uncle of the elf who like made the elves militant and conquering the local areas for resources was their entire dwarf like sort of mining and crafting city was taken over by elves because of that uncle. It has been ruled by elves, and the reason why the dwarf is just drinking so much now is out of sorrow that the dwarven kingdom is now ruled by this militant elf who is actually the uncle of the ranger.
And one of the things here is that this I see the player versus character. Yes. If one of your players just likes to drink, it's probably an out-of-game conversation.
Well, yeah, and it could be an out-of-game problem that the elf player just talks about their backstory so much that the other player is just drinking.
But one of the things that this has is that there is a bit of an implicit thing going on with this setting here, that this may be a little bit more of a PC-directed setting as opposed to one that has, like, you know, here's your giant setting book. And so if you had one that's more of a here's your giant setting book, then you would be latching more on to like, oh yeah, you know, my character went to this kind of thing or whatever. Generally, like, it's a lot easier to improvise if you are not claiming superlatives. Because like if you...
my character was the first and best graduate of this academy that's been around for 500 years. Yeah. And then you're like, wait, what? But no one else ever graduated until now. It's been here for 500 years, but they expelled everyone.
Yeah.
Until now, I'm the first graduate.
But, like, because if you're taking something that's big in the setting and saying that, like, your character had a really big role with that could complicate things for the GM, like, and you need to talk through and figure out, okay, you know, how does that work out for everything else? Whereas it's much easier to be like, you know, my character is from a small town. That is, you know, my character's from a small town in Kyonin, and in that town they have a small magic academy, and that's where this sort of thing came about.
The Small Magic Academy has had a total of 10 students of all time, and I was the best one of those 10.
Yeah, but I think too, like, because sometimes if you have a player who goes like super big, like, you know, oh yeah, the Small Magic Academy is run by sprites. Thank you, I love that suggestion. But like if you have a player who goes too big and is like, you know, my character wants to become a god, like, and that doesn't fit with the scope of the campaign. That's one of the examples that we've talked about on here before, is a literal example.
My character already is a god.
Then like it's harder to work with that sort of thing. So like the more it's tailored to be able to fit in easily, the easier it is going to be for the GM to knit all that together.
Yes. Just revealed my improvised backstory is that I was once a god, but I was stripped of my deific powers by my fellow gods out of jealousy of my greatness. Because I was the best and most superior of all gods, using as many superlatives as possible.
Yes, there you go.
But when they banded together, they were slightly stronger, and they forced me now to be a level 1 character, and I must build back up to my strength of godness again.
Yeah. And another, talking about, don't rouse the mantis. Yep. Totally right, sister. So like another thing too is considering how those kinds of bits that you improvise can create interesting interactions among characters. So we talked about maybe they had you know, they both happened to go to the same place or whatever, or maybe they have experiences that might lead to them having philosophies that interact with each other in an interesting way. You know, where they, you know, not necessarily
one of them saw a herd of wildebeest, and the other one has a philosophy of don't worry about stuff too much. It's not going to be a problem.
There you go.
Stop being so high-strung just because of the fact your dad was killed by wildebeest by your uncle. So that's a way that the philosophies can interact with each other.
I think I had an actual example and it just fell out of my brain. But anyway.
Isn't that an actual example, Linda? It's from storytelling. It's based on Hamlet.
Okay, fine. Yes, so the paladin and the rogue who's always stealing stuff.
Constantly stealing everything.
And then you could be like, well, how did they get to be that way? You know, what led the paladin to becoming a paladin, and like how they respond to the rogue who's constantly stealing things is going to have a lot to do with their philosophy, which is also going to have to do with like the experiences that they've had.
If they're just two randos who don't want to be together, that's one thing. But now imagine that the paladin and the kleptomaniac rogue are like brother and sister, and they both had different reactions to their family situation. Like maybe like they had an abusive family and the paladin became like a paladin to prevent things like that and just like get really the one situation. The other one became a chaotic kleptomaniac rogue. And so like it's more interesting that their backstory converges than just like, I'm a paladin, I just hate this kleptomaniac rogue. And for some reason we have to deal with them even though they're constantly a problem. Whereas it's like, no, but this kleptomaniac rogue is my sister and I don't know what to do. But I want to try to get her back on the straight and narrow.
I wish you would stop
I understand,
creatively acquiring things.
But I understand why she's like this.
Yeah, she's like, well, why should I respect these kind of rules? These are the things that we need.
As Mitsulu says, Reverend Book from Firefly getting a ride with a bunch of shady people.
Yeah, exactly. And you see, like, why those characters came together.
Definitely. So, improvising backstories is basically, when you think about it, even some of these that we talked about, you could have a few tricks up your sleeve that you sort of planned in advance. Making it a more improvised backstory doesn't mean you can't have a few pieces planned in advance or even more of it. It means that you're being flexible. You're not pushing all of your backstory ideas on people all at once to learn and get into and just hoping the GM can find something in there that they can use, but instead you're pulling out backstory ideas as you think they become relevant and trying to plug them into the campaign at the time, asking for permission just in case. Many groups will just love it when you do this and will say yes most of the time. So
yeah. And, occasionally there might be a thing where the GM's like, Yeah, it could be an issue if you had a connection to this mercantile organization, because the GM knows, that mercantile organization is secretly a front for an evil criminal enterprise, and,
But then maybe you could.
But then maybe you could, and then
maybe you're the stereotypical mafia princess who doesn't know that daddy is secretly mafia and thinks that they're a normal mercantile thing. If you're like, yeah, my dad runs that merchant group.
And then people are like,
If the player says, my dad runs that merchant group, and the GM's like, no, that'll be hilarious. Sure, your dad does run that merchant group.
Yeah, but then the GM is, that's perfect. I was thinking about it in terms of the context of the past thing about, the people who were like, I was the caravan guard and I decided, forget them, I'm going to do something else, if they had that kind of thing. But yeah, figuring it out.
He's in sanitation. Aggressive sanitation.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
But yeah, no, maybe you were a caravan guard and you didn't realize that they were running drugs. Even through the time that you left.
You realized that.
You got out and you never realized that they were.
And so they're like, yeah, it's not a risk because this guy doesn't know anything. And then later on you figure it out.
Later on, maybe there's a plot point where you're called in by the authorities because they saw that you were on a manifest for a previous caravan.
And
they
they're
thought
like,
one of the ones is
what is your thing?
Why were you running drugs? And you're like, what? I wasn't running drugs. I was just on this legitimate caravan.
Or you run into people that, or you said you were part of that business in the past, and then so you run into some of your former coworkers.
Or an enemy mafia group that thinks that you know.
That thinks that you totally know and you don't know.
This person was muscle for the the Carmine cartel. And you're like, what? The Carmine cartel? No, I was you mean the Carmine consortium.
And they're like, you're still gonna protect, still gonna keep playing like you don't know.
Yep. So, if I'm the GM, I'll probably let you say that you're connected to the thing that turns out to be sketchy. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that I often, when I'm doing my mastermind GM stuff, that I do get people involved with. Down to the idea of where, one of my player characters in one of the campaigns just decided he wanted to be part of a secret society that was, trying, since it was a playtest adventure, that was, trying to push the boundaries of the universe and find exploits that he could use to to create, almost glitches in reality, since he was playtesting and, infinite life, other things like that. And so there's a villain organization in that same game that is one near the end villain organization that their literal goal is that they're a secret society that is trying to each finds a unique exploit in much the same way, and that's how you join. And so I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come up with a secret society for you, and this is their name, which I used from the book.
You're very good
from the AP, and I was like, and you're pen pals, and you often write each other about your exploits that you came up with. And in book 5, they went to another plane, and the alchemist PC came up with the last pieces that he needed to create his exploit in character and got legendary crafting. And so he managed to create himself a alchemical clockwork heart of ultimate law that would beat forever. And they then accepted him into the organization, which then they were about to fight in the next book.
Yes.
The rest of the group. And the player couldn't come for the session where they were going into the group's base. And our default in our group is if your player's not there, then your character's just not there.
So we fought our way most of the way through the base.
They fought their way somewhat through, and we ran out of time at the room where that character would have been, because it was with the other alchemist who was in that group, and they were doing an experiment together. And I said, you go in, and you see this alchemist, and you also see Niv, the alchemist from your group. And he seems really surprised, but to get his reaction, we need to wait until next time when his player is here.
And then the player's there.
The other players are like, what? He's actually there? There's not a doppelganger or something? I'm like, well, you'll have to see.
You have to see next session. And then in the next session, the player's just shocked.
In the next session, when he comes in, I was like, okay, so you're doing your thing, and you know where you were. We were talking about it. And suddenly, all the other people rush in with their weapons. And then he was like, what? What are you guys doing here? And then that's how we started that next session.
That was great.
It was pretty good. But you don't always have those perfect situations drop in your lap. But you never get a chance for that if you don't have players
coming up with their ideas,
with something that they want, and a GM who can flexibly find a way to make it fit. And sometimes it's just a perfect fit somehow. It's just that was a preordained match. So basically, it's all about being flexible, finding little nuggets of ideas or connections that you can propose to the GM, and hopefully having a GM who can run with that to make it work in the game. I guarantee you that doing something like this is more likely to meet with success than just giving a giant backstory document at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It is not just because, like, the other players or the GMs are lazy or obstinate or anything like that. It's not even that. Even if the players and GM are like, we'd love to, you know what, and your writing's great, I'm going to read all 10 pages. It's just like, it's hard for them to use it at that point. They're not sure always what's going to happen next.
Like, what parts of it do you want to use? And, like, if you say,
if they're not running a 6-volume adventure path, and even if they are, if they haven't read all 6 parts, they don't know where everything is going to go necessarily.
Yeah, and they also don't necessarily know what you want to get out of it. Like, did you mention your character's, like, backstory and hometown and family because you want it to be relevant in the story? Do you want those characters to show back up again? Do you want, like, what parts of that do you want to see, and what parts of that do you just want to say, oh, that's part of why my character thinks the way they do?
Yeah. So giving just one bite-sized chunk that could potentially hook into the adventure here or sometime soon is so useful for the rest of the group.
So when you're doing your backstory, then you can deliberately include things that are like, you know, and my character was part of an organization, part of a mercantile organization, or like, you know, my character was someone who traveled with a bardic troupe and had once graduated from a bardic college or something like that, where you have like a concept that you give but don't give like the full details, and then you can work with the GM to figure out what those details are and to find a good way to plug it in. Because
you can do a bullet point or a Mad Lib, almost a Mad Lib, right?
Yeah.
Like, my character's defining moment was when they were part of organization, like a Mad Lib, and to be like, GM, fill this in with anything that's useful for your adventure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So even if it is like a more defined setting where you could go through and like look everything up, having things that you know the concept but not the full thing, and then the GM, in that process of helping you figure things out and add details, can make it something that's going to hook in well, and it's something that's all the more satisfying. And then because the GM knows that, then they can be like, oh man, you know, I know something about what this player thinks is going to be cool. I'm going to run with it.
And you can give a few bullet points at the beginning and then save other ones for later that you can bring up throughout the adventure at your campfires, maybe at the end of each session. Slowly, over time, trying to hook in. Do your best, but also be willing to listen when the GM has other ideas. It won't work every time, but when it does work, it's going to feel like the adventure is just like a perfect fit for you because you're improvising and you're going with the flow.
Folks are talking about some troubles that they've had with the massive backstories and trying to figure out some way to
to were you guys here when I tried to give the massive backstory of that elf just extemporaneously off the top of my head? You can go back to earlier in the episode, but I feel you. It completely can happen.
Yeah, and like the feeling that it can feel like you're letting the player down when they write all that and you didn't find a way to get into it. So like, I know this isn't the GM tool side of it, but you can proactively do this as a player. If you realize, I gave my GM a 17-page backstory, and you know, I'd like to find more ways to hook it in. You know, you can let the GM know, you know, here, like, yeah, I gave you a 17-page backstory before, but like, here's some things that would be cool to have show up again. Like, this old rival that I mentioned having in my backstory, like, is still out there, and I haven't seen them in years, and I'm not sure where they are right now, but they might still bear a grudge, or, you know, those sorts of things. So the GM could ask, like, hey, as a GM, you could ask maybe, hey, like, are there certain parts of this that you would definitely want to see coming back again, or, you know, is there an opportunity? I guess if they went back to the village, you know, that you came from, and want to go around and talking to people, like Kitsune Warlock talks about how like dealing with the gazetteer of every NPC from your village, like that could be a lot. But like if you have like one session or two where like you go back and you do visit that village, then the player can think like, oh wow, you know, that's cool. And then maybe then from that you can take something where one of the NPCs from that village decides to come along with them or do something else, because then you can like take something from that whole bit that's resonating the most with your entire group and say, all right, yeah, you know, this childhood friend has decided that they want to come along with you guys for a bit and maybe settle down in this other area, which will be nearer to where you are, because they want to help you with your cause. And then it's no longer like, oh, I need this entire thing.
So to show that I was not even giving a hyperbolic example, considering Warlock said they literally had someone give the names, professions, personalities, classes, etc. of every family member, friend, and coworker the character had ever had. And it was easier to work with the person who just said my dad was from the north. So yeah, see, that elf thing I gave was not even, that was just the beginning of what some of these backstories really are. Yeah. And that's why improvising backstories, or at least being flexible, giving them a little bit at a time, is more usable for your group.
Like in one of the campaigns where I had like a dwarven smith, and I was like, I want her to have a rivalry with her sister. And then like Mark was able to figure out like who that sister could be in the campaign and who she's working for, because it's like, yeah, I have like a really arts focused, like the form matters just as much as the function.
Armor smith.
And
so I said, since you guys are going to go up against a military faction politically in this war for the crown, then you can have a sister who's all about, no, function is function. You need armor that will save lives. It doesn't have to look pretty. And
you can't
they disagree about armor smithing, and then are also on opposite sides of the conflict, of the succession conflict.
And then I was like, you know, that would be cool with me as long as we don't like necessarily have a thing where like my character has to kill her sister. And then Mark's like, yeah, that's not how this would go down. I'm like, all right, cool, let's do that.
Yep. I figured that Linda's group was going to try to do PR victories for the most part, rather than massacres. So yeah, absolutely. It looks like Ashmintalu has an example of joining a mid-campaign
That's awesome.
with a dragon sorceress and finding out the enemies were evil dragon cultists, and the party was super sus for like 5 sessions, thinking that it was a double agent from the dragon cult. Yeah, sometimes you just have a perfect match for what the campaign is all about.
And Katsune also mentions it's also true in PFS that vague improvised backstories let you integrate with other players you meet when your characters click. For sure.
Yep, for sure. In PFS, it's even different because you're just sometimes with a totally different group, and they have to learn what you're about in one shot, and they may never see you again, so shtick.
Absolutely.
Shtick over backstory is very important in PFS.
Yeah, because like the other players at the table, unless you're playing with like a persistent group, are not going to like want to invest the time in learning all about your character, because they're probably just going to adventure with them a few times. But instead giving some idea, you know, like that this person's like a daredevil, or that this person has like this particular personality trait or this particular habit that you can really strongly identify with them, usually works better. And yeah, Ashmintalu just played along with them, maybe. So that's suspicion. Excellent.
Yep. So I think we covered about improvising backstories. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube and head into the outro?
Yes, let's.
All right. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.